Miguel had asked me to do the presentation in English, so I'll go ahead with English. Also wanted to thank René Zazueta for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to do this. So talking about health equity. So it was back in 1948 where we had the first globally agreed upon definition of health as the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And at that time, and this is almost 70 years ago, the objective of the World Health Organization was to achieve the best feasible level of health for all. That is quite a high standard, but it's also difficult to concretely define what it exactly is. In the work that Juan, Garay, and myself have been doing, we're proposing a modification to add the term sustainability, because that is really the most important concern of these centuries. So now we're talking about the definition of the best feasible and sustainable level of health for all. Notice that we have those three modifiers to the definition. Feasible and for all, that means that it needs to be universal. And then the sustainability, of course, which is the tenet of the 21st century. So if we want to measure health, which are the best predictors of health? If we look at many of the socioeconomic variables, and we see that the best fit or the strongest correlation between life expectancy as a measure of health is the GDP per capita. In this graph for 2019, the horizontal axis has the GDP per capita, but notice that it's a logarithmic scale. So we have a very strong correlation between GDP per capita and life expectancy. You see in the blue, most of the African countries.
David, you need to share your screen.
Excuse me?
You need to share your screen.
When we look at health, we need to see which are the root causes of health, what determines health. And what we see is that the social determinants, or rather the living conditions of the population, is what by and large determines the health of a population. And when we look at the component of healthcare services and how that contributes towards the health of a population, it's really marginal. So if you think about it, everything that we've been talking about during the conferences this morning, if you have access to good nutrition, if you have access to water, clean water and sanitation, if you have a good dwelling, if you have access to education, that basically makes up for 70–80% of your health. And so it's important to mention here that in order to have better health, we don't need more hospitals. We need better living conditions. In this graph, you see the relationship between life expectancy and GDP, and it's actually a logarithmic curve, which has some very interesting implications. On the one hand, that green arrow shows that by when you have a GDP per capita over $20,000 per person per year, the life expectancy that does not increase anymore. It sort of levels off. But when you are in the low end of the GDP, then very small increments in GDP per capita create very important increases in life expectancy. So that is a relationship that is important to remember. Now, the question is that the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the world over use the high-income countries as the reference models. But the critical question here is whether those high-income countries are healthy, feasible, and sustainable models for all. High-income countries are healthy. Well, if we measure health by life expectancy, yes, high-income countries have a life expectancy of about 80 years. Now, is that health accomplished by those living conditions feasible to be replicated to the entire world is the second question. And we see that the average income level for high-income countries is about $44,000 per capita, whereas the world average is about 1/4 of that, so about $11,000 per capita. So it's really not, we don't have enough resources in the world to replicate the living conditions of a high-income country for the 7.8 billion people that we are on planet Earth. And the most important reason really is that is that of sustainability. There is no high-income country that has a carbon emission rates under what we call the recycling capacity of the planet. Eduardo Mueller was talking about the planetary boundaries, and for CO2 recycling capacity is about 2 metric tons per capita per year. And high-income countries have emissions of about 11 metric tons per capita. And the world average is, even the world average is above, I don't know, 5 metric tons per capita. So the conclusion here is that it doesn't really make any sense to try to follow the development or economic model of the high-income countries, because they are not feasible to be replicated and because they are not sustainable for all. If we use, if we go then around the world, are there other models? We're going to use some proxy indicators, and as I said, we're going to use for health, life expectancy. For the feasibility to be replicated, we're going to use GDP per capita, and for a measure of sustainability, we're going to use a proxy measure for the use of natural resources, and that is the carbon emissions. So we're going to go around the world looking for countries that have a life expectancy that are, we can say healthy, above the world average, which is about 71 years, that are able to achieve that life expectancy over 71 years with a GDP that is less than the average for the entire world, so that it is mathematically possible to replicate for everybody. And that's around $10,000 per capita per year. And then in terms of sustainability, that countries that have carbon emissions below that planetary boundary of 2 metric tons per capita. So if we go in and chart in a map, in blue are all the countries that have a life expectancy over 71. And there are many countries around the world, including all of the global north that have. But the moment that we add, not only are they healthy, but are they feasible to be replicated, that is with a GDP below the world average, that number drops. And what you can notice in the map is that all of the countries from the global north have dropped from the model because they're not replicable. And the third condition was that of sustainability. So, CO2 emissions less than 2 metric tons per person per year. And we found when we initially did this analysis in 2012, we found that there were 14 countries actually that that fit the model, and we call them healthy, feasible, and sustainable countries. And you see that those countries are led by Costa Rica. Back in 2012, Costa Rica and both Costa Rica and Cuba, which lead this list, have actually a life expectancy that is greater than that of the United States. When we repeated the analysis back in 2015, some of the countries dropped from the model, but Costa Rica continues being the country with the highest life expectancy. So in a way, these countries are more efficient in the use of resources and have a healthy population in such a manner that they provide the living conditions to have that life expectancy, and they do not pollute the world. With these 14 countries, now 7 countries, we repeated this analysis from the time that we have data that's from the 1950s up until now, and they have been consistently in this group of sustainable, healthy, feasible, and sustainable models. The country with the highest life expectancy is Costa Rica. The most efficient countries in the model are Vietnam and Sri Lanka, and the lowest polluters are Sri Lanka and Paraguay. Now, so what we say is that we should use these countries that are healthy, feasible to replicate, and sustainable as the benchmark for where we need to point, and not only for the countries that have poor health indicators, but also for the for the countries that have high pollution, and they need to look for ways to decrease that. An important concept here is the notion that equity and equality, although they are both terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, they're not really synonyms. Equity comes from a Latin root that's related more to fairness and justice, whereas equality comes from a similar but different Latin root that comes more from mathematics, where quantity A is equal to quantity B. So we can say that inequality is really any difference, but an inequity is an ethically unfair difference, and that is an important notion to keep in mind. If we talk, for example, about the wealth inequity, it would be an ethically unfair wealth difference. Oxfam put this statistic back in 2016, where it said that the 62 richest people on Earth had the same amount of wealth as the 3.6 billion poorest people, and they updated that statistic to in 2020, that the richest 1% of the population has more than double the wealth of the bottom 88% of the world's population. That's they have more than double than 6.9 billion people in the world. So why is equity important? Plato, about almost 2,500 years ago, said this. He said that the form of law that I propose would be as follows. In a state which is desirous of being saved from the greatest of all plagues, there should exist among its citizens neither extreme poverty nor excessive wealth, for both are productive of great evil. Now the legislators should determine what is to be the limit of poverty and of wealth. Well, this proposal from 2,500 years ago, we haven't really done a very good job. We have barely talked a lot about the poverty line, and we haven't done much about excess wealth accumulation. Why is it important to have a lower limit, and where should that limit be? I think that is one of the questions. That lower limit should be given by the living conditions for a dignified life. A dignified life so that all of the people can develop their full potential. It's a human's right framework. That uses a vision of expanded opportunities. We are trying to increase the base of creative human energy. And also because it's our ethical duty. We are the generation with the greatest amount of economic resources in the history of humankind, and we should base our decisions on empathy, solidarity, and justice, and not on charity. But the other side is also very important, and it's the upper limit. Why should we have an upper limit for accumulation? Well, we should have limits for excess wealth accumulation, because at one point, excess accumulation becomes into hoarding. Hoarding is actually a psychiatric disease of accumulating beyond need. Also because there are limits to excess exploitation of resources, and that goes into sustainability and the concept of intergenerational equity. If we use more of our natural resources now and during our generation, we're basically stealing from generations to come. And then also because all that use of excess use of resources is tied to pollution and all the impact that it has on climate change. So it's very important to determine that upper limit. And here's what we call, with Juan, we have developed this concept of the equity zone. So the equity zone that would have a lower limit, which would be, as I said, the conditions for life with dignity that allows for the development of full potential. An upper limit that is that of where do we draw the line and what we call excess accumulation. and then that we should live within the planetary boundaries, as Eduardo Miller was talking about in the previous lecture, and then that the mobility within that equity curve should be given by the contributions to the common good. So if we use this proposed law by Plato, we can interpret it as an equity zone law. And I'm going to put here a graph where you have in the left axis, in the vertical axis, the population, in the horizontal, the GDP per capita. And that's more or less the distribution of the population by GDP per capita. We're going to add to this graph another vertical axis, which is the GDP. And here is the distribution of GDP. And so if in here we hypothetically put in a limit of the world average GDP per capita, which is around $10,000, and we build that equity zone curve, we're going to try to use social policies to push the population distribution towards the inside of the curve. And then we're going to use fiscal equity to bring the monetary resources into the equity zone. And we're at a point where we that fiscal equity might include also some measures of the growth and frugality, as has been discussed by some. Using this model, what we try to do is to try to calculate what is the economic gap of the global health inequity. And what we did is we used the most efficient countries from the group of 7 and 14 countries as a reference. And we saw that no country has achieved the life expectancy above the world average, that's over 71 years, with a GDP less than 2,500. And if we use the average of all those countries, is about 4,500 per capita. That's basically the amount of GDP that you need in order to have those conditions for life with dignity. And if we calculate that gap by using the real GDP from each country and bring it up so that at least every country has either 2,500 or 4,500, the gap is between 2.5 and 5 trillion. Those are big numbers, and sometimes it's difficult to get a sense of where of what that number means. So we try to give some points for comparison. If you compare, for example, the total global foreign aid, all the money that went from the global north to the global south in 2014, it was about 120 billion. That is only between 2.5 and 5% of the gap. So that debunks a whole notion that international cooperation is going to be the way to solve all of the problems. With that amount of international cooperation that only get at the most 5% of the gap, we can only be talking about mitigation. We cannot talk about transformation. And when we calculate also that those 2.5 to 5 trillion represent about 3.5 to 7% of the global GDP. So we can, if we can say that with about $7 out of every $100 of the world's wealth, we should be able to provide the conditions for life with dignity for all 7.8 billion people in the world. We should find a way of doing it. So just to finalize, talking about the concept of sustainable health equity as a compass for social justice, it would be important to consider social health equity in all policies. If we would have something where it is the Senate where we create all of the laws, and the ethical role of all of the Senate back in Roman times, which was considered the Council of the Wise Elders, was to think about the short, the mid-term, and the long-term implications of all the laws. Unfortunately, now Senates worldwide are hijacked by short-sighted economic interests. So what if we would run each piece of legislation and see how that law is going to affect the health of humans and the health of the environment and the well-being of both, uh, not only now, but as some of the Native Americans say, the 7 generations to come, then we would live in a different world. So I just leave you with that and the thoughts of Mahatma Gandhi saying that the greatness of a nation is measured by how it treats the most vulnerable of its members. And with this, I pass along to my colleague Juan Garay. Thank you.
So we are lagging behind, and really David has said it very thoroughly. I will just add a couple of figures and a couple of examples on this study that we have been doing together for 10 years. As he said, in the first 5 years, 2010 to 2000, the data from 2005 to 2010, we identified 14 countries that were replicable, they were sustainable, and they were granting healthy lives to their citizens. From 2010 to 2015, the data showed us that that number had halved to 7 countries. We will very soon, next year, start analyzing the next quinquennium from 2015 to 2020, and we are really afraid that we may find no country with those criteria. The world is really moving towards complete unsustainable dynamics that not only harm people among themselves, like David was saying, because of inequities, but also the coming generations. So I will just give you a couple of examples, and I also want to mention that this work with David and others also has the very important contribution of Nefer Kelly, who is listening to us from California. So let me give you a few data on this. So I'll go very quickly because as I said, we're lagging behind and we'd like some questions. What David has shown us is that there are models that can be healthy, feasible, and sustainable. If we compare those models with the rest of the world, we can estimate the price of injustice in human lives between generations and within these generations. The excess mortality rate of each country and disaggregated by its age groups and gender, and of course throughout time, and even in some countries within regions, if we compare those mortality rates with the reference healthy, replicable, and sustainable models, those excess mortality rates give us an idea of the unnecessary excess mortality, which is the price of injustice. If we apply that excess mortality rate to the specific population groups within each of those countries, age groups, etc., we have what we call the burden of health inequity, which is something as tragic as excess mortality due to injustice. We believe this is the most powerful barometer of injustice that societies can use, citizens can argue, and governments have to respond. Now, if we, in order to have it more comparable, if we divide that excess mortality by the overall mortality, excess deaths by all deaths, then we have the relative burden of health inequity, which is the proportion of deaths in any given country, region, period, etc., which are due to injustice. Now, let me give you a few data on how we have been calculating this. These are millions of data we're calculating every 5-year periods where we have new data to analyze and see how the world is moving. This is the burden of health inequity, which is the excess number of deaths that are preventable and that are due to injustice. And you can see this from 1950, how it's been moving. And this is in women that in the last period, it was of over 8 million, and in men, which was slightly less than 7 million. So it was close to 16 million deaths last year. Excess mortality, which is preventable, unnecessary, and due to injustice. It's not due to tuberculosis or to cardiac failure or to cancer or even to COVID. The real reason is injustice. And that's what the way we need to see it. And this is the age distribution. It's still very high in under 5s, but then gradually it's getting more higher and higher in over 50, and you will see later why. This is both in male and female. Now, this is the relative burden of health inequity, which is even more telling. Which proportion of deaths in any given country or in the world, and we have interactive maps and graphs so you can consult these, which proportion of deaths is due to injustice. And you can see that in the world, it's been moving from 30 to 40%, and it's always higher in women. So we can summarize that 1 in 3 deaths every year is in excess, is due to injustice. The real medical certificate should read, this person has died due to injustice. And this is the distribution among ages. And it is different from the net burden because the denominators are different. And you can see that adolescent health, which is also something really, really important and also fundamental to raise values and to have hopes for the coming generation, is also very, very high. Now let me move on. This is a small video that shows you how the relative burden of health inequity has been evolving in the world. Those countries in red show that more than half of all deaths taking place in those countries were due to injustice. Can you imagine how tragic that most deaths could have been prevented in those countries? And you see Sub-Saharan Africa and some regions of Asia are the worst hit. But there have been periods where also Russia and the ex-Soviet Union and of course parts of India and of Africa and even some bits of Latin America have had a huge burden of disease. Now, there is one thing we need to start looking at, which is within particularly large countries, we need to look for specific states or provinces that may be replicable and sustainable and healthy, because we are basically running out of countries that are sustainable, healthy, and that offer a well-being that can maintain those rights and those conditions for the coming generations. And we are identifying some areas like Kerala in India, or like Chechnya and Ingushetia in Russia, some parts of northeast Brazil, and some provinces in China. And then we want to go even lower, some of the lower regions. We can also do subnational analysis of burden of health inequity. Say that you are in the US and you identify those states in the US that are not having GDP above the national average and that have life expectancy above the national average. None of the states, or as you will see later, in the US or in Europe, are sustainable because they all have carbon emissions above the ethical threshold that David was saying. So we can also have, and have done so, analysis at sub-country level or sub-regional level. For instance, in Europe, these regions in green are regions that can have life expectancy much higher than the average, GDP much lower, and that are on track to have carbon emissions, not yet, but that they could be on track, particularly with the EU policy now on carbon neutral by 2050. And so for instance, some of these regions, particularly in Spain, have much, much higher life expectancy than German, Swedish, and others, while living much more simpler. So that's a very clear example how excess accumulation is not good for you, it's not good for others, it's not even good for those to come. And this is the map of the sub-regions in Europe in terms of the burden of health inequity, the relative burden of health inequity. And this is what David was saying. We need to go towards this equity curve, which has a minimum income in the world that allows access to progress, access to well-being, access to means that enable persons to have both good living conditions, but also in the event of disease or other risks have some access to, for instance, health services. And we're seeing now in COVID how the access to potential treatments or vaccines is being restricted by the hoarding maneuvers of multinationals and rich countries. And this is the upper threshold. And it's interesting because some of these regions in Spain, particularly where I'm talking now from, I came from Cuba yesterday, but here we have very good life expectancy below this upper threshold. So within this equity curve, you have the highest life expectancies in the world. You don't need to go beyond, and you have a very good distribution of wealth and access to knowledge. So I'm reaching the end now. We've done something with this, so which is very telling, very provocative, if you wish, which is the negative impact. Not just that it is illogical to accumulate an excess or to have carbon emissions, but what is the negative impact we have on others? We've tried to quantify that. So through excess accumulation, we calculate how many life years, not only excess deaths, but how each of those deaths that are in excess is premature, how many years is premature to the life expectancy. So we calculate what we call life years lost to inequity, which are approximately 500 million life years lost per year now due to these huge inequities. And we divide that by the deficit gap of the countries and regions that are living below the deficit threshold, and which is only a share of the excess accumulation of others that have so much unneeded. And we can calculate how many life years are lost per each $1,000 in excess of the upper threshold. So being wealthy, and Gandhi, who was quoted by David earlier, he also said, when I have more than my brother and he doesn't have enough to live, I'm stealing him. And this is as crude as here. We do it, we have calculated it with, with numbers. So we know how much of your excess translates in loss of life of others. And in terms of carbon emissions, how much of your excess carbon emissions, and we've done this with a very, very detailed analysis of how only global warming is associated with highest mortality rates per each age group from here till 2100, and we have calculated 230 million excess deaths just due to global warming, and how much of those life years lost is related to the excess carbon emissions. So by doing so, we can calculate, okay, let's do what we call a holistic life expectancy index, which is a holistic health index to know better what is happening in the world. We look at the health life expectancy and healthy life expectancy of men, women, but we also look at what we need to deduct from that life expectancy at birth, which is the damage you do in others through hoarding, through excess accumulation, and the damage you do on others through excess carbon emissions. That has a price on others, and it should be deducted from your let's say, well-being, because you are harming others. So in a non-individualistic way, but looking at how you live, but also how you influence in others, the best holistic life index, again, is Costa Rica Health Index. But all these other countries that I have plotted here, Canada, Netherlands, Denmark, etc., which sound to everyone like development models, and they have, in fact, the highest, I've taken here, the highest human development index, have life expectancies below 50. None of them are sustainable, and we are going the wrong way, following their seemingly development models and theories. So I'll just finish with what David was saying. We need to go towards societies that limit excess, limit the deficit. We need, within the equity curve, we live also in harmony with planetary boundaries, and we reward those that contribute to common good and not just to individual grief. I would leave it there. Thank you so much.